right, let's try that again. Good evening, everyone. This is incredible. We have a full house. My name's Laurel Birchfield. I'm the Advocacy Director at Mainstream Civic Engagement. And thank you so much for joining us tonight, for giving up your Tuesday, right? Tuesday evening to learn about Project 2025. I want to go ahead and thank our sponsors. It looks like we're getting our screen up. It'll be just a second. But we do have some amazing sponsors for our Defending Democracy series of events. So I just want to thank our sponsors, Don Gould Cohen, Kathy and Terry Matlack, and Estelle Berman. Thank you so much for supporting us. I also want to thank Smooch. They are hosting us tonight and have offered this wonderful facility for our evening. And also Representative Nikki McDonald and her husband Patrick McDonald for having us here tonight and hosting us. So we're going to learn about Project 2025 tonight. And we're going to learn from these amazing panelists. I'm so grateful to each of you for joining us and for being willing to do a bunch of research and then share that expertise with us in the room. We are also going to have time for audience Q&A. So before I introduce our panelists, you may have received a little note card already, but if you have a question that comes to mind as we're going through the panel, feel free to raise your hand. We have a couple gentlemen walking around who are able to give you a little index card. They may or may not have a writing utensil. You may have to use blood. We'll see what comes out. And then when you're done writing your question, you can raise it again and they'll come get it for you, and we'll get to that at the end of the program. So our panel tonight, we are first joined by Clay Wirestone, who is the opinion editor at the Kansas Reflector and is celebrating his third year there. Absolutely my favorite place to get good information and good opinions. So thank you. Next to Clay, we have Representative Susan Ruiz from the Kansas State District 23. There we go. For those who don't know, Susan represents areas of Overland Park, Lenexa, and Shawnee. Next to her, we have, wrong order, Dr. Andrea Bude. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Thank you. She is the Johnson County Community College Associate Professor of Political Science. Thank you for joining us. And finally, Dr. Amy Castle, who is a KU professor in the Schools of Law, School of Business, and the Department of Political Science. Thank you. All right, so let's get started. Before we kind of dig into it, a little audience participation. How many of you feel like you know a good amount about Project 2025? Show of hands. Some. How many of you have read all 900 plus books? Okay, we got one. All right, how many of you came here tonight because you really don't know anything and you're here because you just need to know what's going on? Thank you for raising your hands, because that is absolutely the most powerful thing you can do right now is say, I need to learn about this. So Clay, you're going to educate us. Project 2025 has been in the media and in our social media feeds for quite a while. It was actually published in early 2023 by the Heritage Foundation. Now, for those of us who may just be learning or haven't had a chance to read all of it, can you catch us up a little bit on what's going on with their 900 pages of a mandate for leadership? Who is the Heritage Foundation who published this? Why did they publish their playbook for everybody to be able to read and dissect? And how's that going for them?
Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you all here. This is, now I'm a little shy, but I think the thing to understand about Project 2025 is that it is simultaneously kind of more and less important than you imagine. And that takes a little bit of history to explain why that's so. So the Heritage Foundation started up in 1973, and it was part of, many organizations on kind of the conservative side of the aisle, started around that time because you have the twin kind of revolutions of the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt and the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson, which really saw a change in how the federal government behaved. It started doing a lot more, it got a lot larger, and kind of all of the intellectual energy, so to speak, was kind of to the left. It was to people trying to reform or enlarge or change how government acted. And so a lot of folks who thought that things before those changes were better, or who wanted to kind of restrain it in one way or another, decided they better start investing their time and money in it too. And today you can see there's a huge number of groups more or less along the same lines on the right. So you now have kind of the two sides. But the Heritage Foundation was fairly early. What's interesting about that is that they actually started publishing what we today call Project 2025. It's actually something they put out every 4 years. It's called the Mandate for Leadership. And their first version of that came out in 1980, or for the first Reagan term. And the concept is, right, because Heritage is a nonprofit organization, it's actually technically nonpartisan. Now, it may have a political wing that I think it's called Heritage Action, actually, that does direct lobbying and work for candidates. But the Heritage Foundation itself, technically, while it's conservative, the mandate for leadership is available to any person who becomes president. If a Democrat wanted to do it, so be it. But it actually, the Heritage Foundation, pretty much from early on, found, I think, fairly good success because, starting a new presidential term is always difficult. I mean, the machinery of the federal government is large, it's vast, it's sprawling, and so the mandate for leadership is essentially just goes down the list of all of your federal agencies and offers suggestions and offers, kind of the conservative roadmap for what a new president might do. Now, what's interesting is that the Heritage Foundation has had kind of a rocky time in the Trump years. But when Trump was becoming the nominee in 2015, some of the top people at Heritage were very dubious of him. They eventually all came around. And then, most recently, their new president or CEO leader, Kevin Roberts, I believe he is, took over, I want to say 2021, 2022, and has really aligned Heritage very closely with all of the priorities of the Trump administration and kind of the administration in waiting. It's important to note, too, that in 2017, when Trump started his first term, Heritage, it really turned to the mandate for leadership that Heritage had published that year. It had actually vetted a lot of people, and a lot of those people went on to work in the Trump administration, just because if any of you followed how things went when Trump started, they hadn't laid a lot of groundwork, right? So for the potential second Trump term then, Heritage really decided to pull everything together in a little more media-savvy way than they had before. So see, this is the key. It's something that they had regularly done, but it had never kind of had its own name, its own branding, its own folks going out and kind of giving interviews about it and saying, hey, look at this thing we've done. And that's what Project 2025 was. I mean, fundamentally, right, it is just a 900-page document suggesting a bunch of changes or a bunch of ways to run the federal government. I think so that's why in some ways it's kind of less, right? I mean, it's something that an organization has put out regularly. It's something that, there's a lot of nonprofit organizations that put out manifestos of various sorts. So that's perhaps not unusual. Where I think it actually does have a lot of importance is that almost all of the chapters in Project 2025 are written by people who actually worked for Trump, or work for Trump, or have some connection to him and his organization. Now, it's important to note that once Project 2025 began to actually become known, when the word began to spread and people said, oh my goodness, this sounds bad, Trump and his folks really hated it. Because they hate anything that seems to tread on them, or tread on, the main man, and the main man being able to get out his message. So he's very publicly distanced himself from Project 2025. He's very publicly said, I don't have any idea what's in it, I don't know any of these people, which is a lie. I don't have anything to do with it, and has supposedly led to the Heritage Foundation disbanding it, although there was really nothing to disband because they'd already written the damn thing and put it out. The idea that you're disbanding it, the guy wasn't fired, he just got a different title. So the important point here, though, right, is that whatever Donald Trump says, the people who wrote it and the people whose ideas it encapsulates are almost inevitably going to be the people working for him. Or they're going to be the people with outsized influence in his administration. So I think it's important that when you talk about Project 2025, there is the document, but there's also just the fact of these are the folks, these are the ideas, this is the reality.
Thank you. And it's a bit of a machine at this point. There's an academy, there's training videos, there's talking points. There's quite a bit beyond just that 900 pages.
Well, so this is part of it too, is that if you recall back in when Trump was elected, he'd actually had a transition team put together by Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, and Chris Christie had worked for months putting together this transition team and these transition documents, and Trump just threw it all away and told everyone to start again. So I think with that experience kind of in their mind, the folks at Heritage actually went a little above and beyond in preparing this. So yes, as Laurel said, there's actually a whole series of training videos for stuff. I think there's like a sign-up portal and some things that they're also doing to try to vet people to be ready, to apply should the time come to be in the administration. So there certainly are other elements of that, but to an extent, I also think that's probably they're just imagining, well, we don't think there's going to be anything more organized this time around, so we're just going to do it.
Thank you, and I should acknowledge at this point that we've said Trump's name quite a few times. Mainstream civic engagement is a nonpartisan 501c3, so we do want to make sure that we are talking about this in terms of the issues. We're acknowledging kind of how that falls along the aisle in modern American politics. But truthfully, this is a machine. This is a document of the Republican Party, and not just that, the very extremist part of the Republican Party. So when you hear us refer to Trump, refer to Republicans, we're talking about that very extreme part of what we're seeing in modern politics now. And so kind of on that line of extremism, a few weeks ago, Mainstream hosted a screening of the film Bad Faith, Christian Nationalism's Unholy War on Democracy. Did anyone in the room make it to that screening, or have you seen Bad Faith? Oh, good. That makes this question for you, Representative Louise, a lot easier. So the amazing part of that video for me is that they're saying the quiet parts out loud and proudly saying that we want this country to be a very extreme, narrow version of Christianity, and we will do anything up to and including violence to make that happen. So Representative Ruiz, we see that in Project 2025, right? It's kind of interwoven all throughout.
In my mind, the Christian nationalism, it's an ideology. It's the thread that goes through the entire document. And for me, it is the foundation on which they have built everything up. And as Clay had talked about, that the first version of it came around when President Reagan, the actor, I just think of him as an actor, when he was elected. And so those of you who saw Bad Faith, you saw that, how there was the Christian nationalism, the whole Christianity was very much galvanized in order to try to not just elect him, but to put people in place and to create policies that are in line with Christianity, with that way of thinking. But as I hope that we know, that this form of Christianity is very narrow. And it is not a Christianity that most Christians think is Christianity at all. It's extremely narrow. And also know that Hitler used, he had the Hitler Youth. And he used the Hitler Youth to get the kids to take their parents to church. And so when they all went to church, they started, the whole piece of Germany first, just like with America first way of thinking. That all came together. And before they knew it, Hitler actually took over, because he took over the Christianity, and it became a way of thinking, a way of being, a way of excluding people versus including people. So the exclusionary piece is extremely troubling, of course, and the whole point of it is to create a theocracy, to get rid of our democracy and base it on a theocracy, but it's based again on a very narrow ideology or a very narrow version of Christianity.
Absolutely, and I think the mechanism for how those who are utilizing the Christian faith and the Christian church to get their message out is also critical for us to kind of acknowledge here. Sorry. It's being weaponized just like you're talking about, Representative. But the people who are part of Project 2025, part of these organizations that make up the 100 organizations that make up this effort, they're using conservative media, they're using the church to get their message out and to mobilize. They're doing exactly what you just described with Hitler. They're using those tools that people go to for comfort and safety and community, and they're mobilizing people with these extremist messages in those safe spaces and kind of going to the channels with the conservative media where they have a captive audience. And Project 2025 absolutely captures that and carries it forward. Dr. View, I want to talk about some of the specific policies that Project 2025 lays out, because we know that there is a lot, and as Clay kind of explained to us, they really do attempt to go department by department and talk about the changes that we want to see. One of those departments that really scares me, especially being in Kansas, is the Department of Education. So here in Kansas, we have constantly battled at the State House efforts to bring in voucher schemes that reroute money from public schools to private, often parochial schools. And we fight that every single year along with our partners. Now, Project 2025 wants to completely abolish the Department of Education. What else do they want to do? How are they trying to remake education in this country?
Right, so I'll just reiterate what has been said related to Reaganism, in a sense of when you read the education chapter, it very much looks like Reaganism on steroids. Or if we think back to Rick Perry during the 2012 presidential primaries, talking about the different departments that he wanted to eliminate, the 2 or the 3. But one of them was the Department of Education. And so that's one of the big points in Project 2025, is to completely abolish the Department of Education. And then essentially what they're calling for are things like getting rid of the Title I funding that goes to lower income school districts, and instead replacing those with block grants with no strings attached. And so I hear some people saying, oh no, and it's true, because what we do know about block grants with no strings attached, that means you can spend it on anything. So that the money that has been designated for things like Title I schools or for programs for students with disabilities, these would be turned into block grant programs that would allow states to spend that money on anything. The other piece of this this kind of plan is that eventually all of the funding for state and local education would be pushed down to the states. And so the federal government over time, and I believe it's a 10-year plan, would, over time, it would basically, the federal government would step out of education entirely and leave all of this to state and local governments. Now, if you're in a state that values public education, great. If you're not in a state that values public education, that's going to be a problem. So going back to what was just stated, you know, in Kansas with these school finance lawsuits, making sure that the state is adequately funding public schools, we would then be dependent on a state to fund education that has historically had to go to court to force the state to do that. And so that's a big piece of these programs. Speaking about another thing that you mentioned with, you know, school choice, vouchers? Yes, vouchers, and then another part of school choice, which is those education savings accounts. The thing about voucher programs that we do know is that vouchers often do not actually adequately fund private school tuition. So the people that are actually able to take advantage of vouchers are going to be the people that are able to pay for private school tuition anyway, and the people that actually need the vouchers to pay for school would still be left behind. The other thing that happens with school vouchers is that once states pass school voucher laws, oftentimes private schools will jack up the tuition, knowing that they can do that because now they're moving money around, right? So it leads to a system where there's a lot less regulation on policies that protect kids. And that, when I think back to what's the purpose of the federal, or why did the federal government get involved with education to begin with, it was because states weren't acting right. And when states don't act right, you actually need the national government to come in and tell them what they need to do correctly. So provide services for students with disabilities, make sure we're protecting LGBTQ kids in the classrooms, making sure that public schools aren't discriminating against students. There's a bunch of different policies, and again, to Mr. Wirestone's point, it's very specific what they're talking about. So there's some schools that we've known that have just disciplinary procedures tend to affect students of color more than anybody else. There's a bunch of studies within education about that. The Department of Education looks into that. They will end that practice. So there's a bunch of different specific policies that would ultimately put our kids in jeopardy if the Department of Education went away. And I think that's the big takeaway.
Absolutely. I mean, the Office of Civil Rights falls under the Department of Education. That's the office that would investigate those claims that are about anti-Semitism in our schools and on our college campuses. There's a lot of ways that abolishing this department affects not just the classroom learning of our students in our public schools, but the funding, the way that they're treated, the way that we prepare them for lives outside of education.
Right, and I'm really focused on K-12 just now, but it also impacts college. So one of the policies is get rid of the student loan program entirely and move everything privatized. What we know about private student loans is you have lenders that are not treating their clients the best way possible. They might have jacked up interest rates or variable interest rates, all sorts of ways to get people into a debt trap. Those student loan borrowers would no longer have those protections because the loan system would move into the private sector. I'm sorry to add that in there, but
no, it's great. And I'm wondering if I can also ask you, in states like Kansas and other Midwestern states, we already have a problem with being able to sustain our schools in our rural communities. How do you see some of this impacting some of those areas?
Right, and it goes back to the point about vouchers. Is it profitable for a private school to operate in rural areas? Oftentimes the answer is no, because there's not going to be enough students, customers, as we hear all the time. So it would, suburban, urban areas probably would still have some amount of private schools around, but when you get into less densely populated areas, there's less opportunity. And so a lot of education policy is making sure that we continue public schools in areas where it's not profitable to do education. Is this me?
No.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry, technical difficulties.
Well, just touching something, so I wasn't sure.
Okay, we're gonna try not to have too much static up here, apologies. And I'm asking each of you kind of targeted questions, but if anybody else wants to chime in, yeah.
So Project 2025 also wants to completely eliminate Head Start.
Right, free and reduced price lunch. Just when you think of the diversity of the student populations, essentially all these programs that those students would go away. And so that's a major concern.
I also want to point out that I heard the phrase block grants being used over here, and I think it's important that people understand that we've actually already seen in the federal government the effect of turning a program into a block grant, which is what happened with welfare reform, quote unquote, in 1996. Welfare was at one point an entitlement. That is, it was something that people received, and if there was a greater need, there would be more money allocated to it because there was more need. I mean, this is traditionally how entitlements work. So, you know, a SNAP, for instance, or food stamps. If there's more hungry people, more money is spent on SNAP. If there's more people filing for, you know, unemployment, various things like that, these programs expand. Transitioning welfare to a block grant just meant that every state got a flat amount of money, and that's what you had to spend on your poor residents. And in Kansas, we can see what that's happened, which is in most of these states, they're not spent on poor people, number one. And number two, the money allocated in those block grants has not changed since 1996. So, I mean, that's what happens when you go to block grants, and that's why people want to go to block grants, because you're just like, well, they should just spend it smarter.
Another thing that would be affected is college students who are trying to get loans and they're going to a specific college or university, that college or university is also giving or has the ability to give in-state tuition for undocumented immigrants. And so they would take that away. So if you're a student going to that college, you would not be able to get any assistance at all from anybody. You would get penalized. And I think there was I read there were like 25 states that do that.
So I think we're definitely learning. Project 2025 has a very clear vision of who should be benefiting and thriving in our country. So let's change topics, Dr. Castle. Let's go to abortion and talk about reproductive rights, because they certainly do in this document, right? So we all know here in Kansas, we fought hard to preserve our right to safe and legal abortion. We just celebrated 2 years of that 2022 vote. So Project 2025 wants to take that away. And so they are doing things in this document like calling for the renaming or rebranding of the Department of Health and Human Services to the Department of Life. And having a pro-life task force within that department.
See, it's that easy. That easy.
So Dr. Castle, things like that, or elements of Project 2025 also include wanting to collect data. Last year in the state, we had a bill that now requires that abortion providers collect non-medical, private, intrusive data for every abortion that they perform. Unfortunately, that's been blocked. But those are the kind of things that we're seeing in Project 2025 that they're trying to do across the country. What else is in there?
So abortion is mentioned around 200 times in Project 2025. And I have a little checklist up here because they don't have a section on abortion. Most of the abortion suggestions come under Section 14, which is under the Department of Health and Human Services, which, as Laurel suggested, they literally want to change the name to the Department of Life, create a task force to propose policies to completely end abortion. So under Project 2025, if they have their way, there will be absolutely no safe and legal abortion or contraception in the country. So a little bit, I'm gonna put my professor hat on here, right? We had, Roe v. Wade, 1973, first 2 trimesters, a woman has a federal constitutional right to access abortion care. And then 2 years ago, the Dobbs decision came down, Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health, that said no, women or anyone who can get pregnant have no federal constitutional right to access abortion care. So what happened in Kansas, if you'll recall, the Republicans proposed an amendment, right? An amendment that would have reversed that decision by the Kansas Supreme Court in 2019 that said women have a state constitutional right to access abortion care. So that case happened in 2019, the amendment happens, we vote no. Almost 70% of Kansans voted to protect reproductive health care. And so, that's where we're at, right? And we voted no, and so at the moment, access to abortion care is legal in Kansas. Now, the Republican-led legislature tries all kinds of things to try to restrict access to abortion care, but fundamentally, it's one of the few states left where it is actually a state constitutional right to access reproductive care. I don't know if this is good. You want me to try that one? All right, so what would Project 2025 do to abortion? Well, completely eliminate abortion and contraception. How would this happen? Well, if you look through the document, most of the stuff on abortion is in section 14 with the DHHS. And so there are 5 or 6 times during that document that says that DHHS should affirm that abortion is not health care. It says this like 5 times in the document. Abortion is not health care. So, specifically though, the granularity and the specificity of what this Project 2025 is suggesting is scary. So, I think the scariest thing, so you've probably heard a debate, if you will, about, oh, well, will Congress pass a national abortion ban? They can't right now, right, because they don't have enough folks in Congress to do it, but that's been an issue, right? Well, Project 2025 says we don't need Congress to pass a national abortion ban. Rather, we have this law, literally this law from 1873 called the Comstock Act. You might have heard of it. And so Project 2025 says we want to revive this 1873 Comstock Act to, so a little bit about the Comstock Act. It is named after a dude, Anthony Comstock, who did not like pornography, who thought contraception and abortion actually led to lewd and lascivious behavior. And so, so back in the late 1800s, the Comstock Act was passed, which prohibits in the mailing pornography, contraception, information about contraception, and anything that might be used to obtain an abortion. So that could be, you know, back then we didn't have, you know, abortion medication, but now it would include abortion medication. It could include specula or gloves that are used in obtaining abortions. And so what Project 2025 says is let's have the Department of Justice, which the Department of Justice, they want to do a lot of things with the Department of Justice, have it really pretty much an arm of the president, but have the Department of Justice revive the Comstock Act. And here's the deal, if they do that, they don't need Congress to pass a national abortion ban. It will be a national abortion ban on any sort of mailing of anything related to abortion services or contraception or pornography. And here's what I get concerned about, like that all like really ticks me off. Like, come on. But the thing is okay, so if you're gonna revive the Comstock Act that prohibits mailing of, pornography and lewd and lascivious materials, so are you really going to criminalize and prosecute people for ordering lingerie by the mail or sex toys? Probably not, right? So my concern is that it's going to be a selective prosecution, right? They're going to use the Comstock Act to actively prosecute folks who are mailing, if you will, any information related to contraception or abortion. So that's kind of the scary one, I think. So then when you get a little bit more granular, in the meantime, if we don't have the Comstock Act as a nationwide abortion ban, what Project 2025 suggests is that then the CDC reverse approval of the abortion medication mifepristone. So most abortions that happen in the United States, a majority happen by medication abortion, and it's a 2-pill regimen, one called mifepristone, one called misoprostol. And so 20 years ago, the FTC approved mifepristone for medication abortions. And so what Project 2025 wants to do is have the FDA rescind approval of mifepristone. So what that means is that in Kansas, where we voted overwhelmingly to have access to reproductive care, that means that we would no longer have any access to medication abortion, meaning that the only way to obtain abortion care would be to have to actually physically go and get a surgical abortion. And so no mifepristone, complete withdrawal of mifepristone. Also, Project 2025 says no abortion pills, no mifepristone after 49 days, okay? So currently, the FDA regulations say no abortion, medication abortions after 10 weeks, 70 days, okay? And so what this would suggest is that at about 7 weeks, a woman or a person who gets pregnant could not use mifepristone. And so, as most women in this audience know, oftentimes by 7 weeks, you don't know you're pregnant, right? And so that time to obtain a medication abortion would be severely limited. Also, Project 2025 wants to make all medication abortions an in-person dispensing requirement. So back when COVID happened, the FDA said you can have telehealth. We have telehealth for lots of things, not just abortion care, right? And so what Project 2025 says is no more a woman or a person who's pregnant has to actually go in person to take the medication and see the physician. So to me, I think, okay, who does this harm in Kansas? Rural Kansans, poor Kansans who might not be able to travel to an actual facility. So no telehealth, reproductive health care. Abortion surveillance, their word, not mine. I swear to God. In their document on page 455, I have all the page numbers here if anybody's interested. So in their document, what they say is that the CDC needs to increase abortion surveillance. So that means, what that in effect means is that what Project 2025 wants to do is to require states to collect certain data, like the reason a person is obtaining abortion care. Take that data and turn it over to the federal government. And literally the document says the CDC needs to increase abortion surveillance. And it's scary. And you know, if honestly, you know, if you, I'm used to talking to 20-year-olds. I see some gray hairs out here, so maybe not quite as, but if you use like an app, a period tracker app, that's scary stuff. That's scary stuff because that's information that actually can be turned over to the government and they can know when you have your periods. So be careful if you're using period tracker apps. Seriously. Most of you maybe not, don't you? Project 2025 wants to completely defund Planned Parenthood. As you know, probably, Planned Parenthood provides valuable sexual and reproductive health care. There are 4 Planned Parenthood facilities: Overland Park, Wyandotte County, Pittsburgh, and Wichita. And so to defund Planned Parenthood, who provides pap smears and testing for sexually transmitted infections, all that goes away with Project 2025. Eliminate the morning after pill. Now, the morning after pill is different than mifepristone. Okay, the morning after pill actually prevents a person from getting pregnant. It prevents the fertilized egg from attaching to the uterine wall. And so the morning after pill is almost routinely given to rape victims, right? Like, just take the pill. And so eliminating the morning after pill would mean that Kansas women who are raped do not have access to a pill that would terminate a pregnancy of their rapist. Okay, I think I've done enough doom and gloom so there's a lot more, and it's kind of crazy because they don't have a section like, this is what we're going to do with abortion. You have to really sort of read the document to go through and see all of the different things that they want to do with respect to abortion. But really, what it amounts to is absolutely no abortions in the United States and no contraception.
Yeah, a little bit of doom and gloom there. Thanks for that. So we want to make sure we have plenty of time for audience Q&A. I see some people already raising their hands asking for cards. So do continue to, if you think of something, raise your hand, you'll get a card, write it down. I have just a couple more questions for our panel and then we'll get to the audience Q&A. Representative Ruiz, we've talked about things a couple times now that have already happened in our state house. They've either attempted to pass this legislation or successfully passed it. One of the things we were able to stop last year, very narrowly stopped it, and it was in large part due to your efforts and your, you being a champion in the State House for LGBTQ plus Kansans, and especially transgender youth. So first of all, thank you. But in Project 2025, they're coming after our LGBTQ people, and especially our children, with things that they're trying to do in our public schools and our health system. I mean, they're trying to roll back protections that have been in place and make it, they're criminalizing our teachers and our professional staff who just want to support transgender students. Having been on the front lines of this in the State House, how do you feel when you read these kind of things in Project 2025? What can we kind of think about here in Kansas? Big question.
That's a big question. Well, you know, a lot of the things that are already contained in Project 2025, you know, these things have been in the works for years, and the Kansas legislature is no different. So, you know, when we talked about Christian nationalism, in that is embedded the thought that a marriage is between a man and a woman, male, female, you have children, and that family is intact. That is what keeps the country safe, it's what keeps the country civil, and is what keeps the country, in the eyes of God, a good country. And if you saw the movie Bad Faith, you saw, you know, people being said, well, you know, they're they're good or they're bad, you know, that's evil, they're the devil. So that is a part of that. So when you look at the transgender individuals, that goes against all of that. It totally goes against it. Now, being an LGBTQ community goes against all that, but they have particularly come after transgender people, but specifically kids. And so there has been legislative bills that have come through that we, you know, thank goodness we've been able to block them. But it is some of the most hurtful things you will ever hear said in front of us. And knowing, because I'll go to the well and say, you've got kids that are listening to us, and they're hearing the most vilest things about them, and it doesn't matter to them because it doesn't fit in that stereotypical sense of what it is to be a woman, what it is to be a man. Back in 2023, last year, we had Senate Bill 180. And that bill, the purpose of that bill, again, is to lay this foundation of what is the definition of what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman, biologically. So we've gone through a lot of that. That's done a lot of damage to the transgender community. But that falls in line with Project 2025. The other thing I really want people to also understand, that there are organizations that come out from the state, they come to the state in order to push forward, you know, the kind of bills that we're seeing. There are organizations within the legislature that the majority party, many of them belong to, and there's one called the Truth Caucus, and you can Google it, Kansas Truth Caucus. It was started by Senator Ty Masterson, and he
Good for President Ty.
Thank you for that, though. He did start that. So every year they put out their priorities. So if you look at the 2024 priorities, they're exactly all the things that we saw, all the bills, including the tax bill that came through. And so it all again, it falls in line with Project 2025. Whether this is intentional, I don't really know. All I know is that it is the same. It is one and the same. And they will pay outside people to come in and testify in committees that they will, you know, to justify their rhetoric, justify their discrimination. It's terrible. But that is one of the ways that the legislature operates. And after the November elections, and between November and when we go back to the legislature, they will have their priorities for 2025. So it'd be something to look at to see what are the things that they're going to try to push through.
So I've got one last question for our panel before we get to your question, so make sure that you're handing those cards over. Clay, we've talked about a lot of issues. These are the primary issues that Mainstream advocates for with our partners at the state level: reproductive rights, LGBTQ plus equality, separation of church and state, public education, but there's so much more in Project 2025. And they want to commercialize the National Weather Service because they think it's too woke. They want to remove seriously. They want to remove any mention of climate change. They want to deregulate banks and change overtime. There's so many things that affect average Kansans. How are they going to do this? Like, what is their proposal for how they're going to actually make these things happen?
So I think this is one of the things that you really need to bear in mind, because of all the stuff in 2025. Trump has talked about some of it directly, some of it's just folks who work for him. But this last part is something he has directly talked about multiple times, and it's called Schedule F. I don't know how many of, any of you have heard of that. A few, yes. So basically Schedule F it has to do with if you work for the government as a non-political civil servant. So in other words, you go and you take it's kind of like becoming an employee of the Postal Service, right? You have to take an exam, you maybe do a tryout, you get hired, and then basically, you know, there's a lot of guidelines in place, a lot of guardrails that protect you, you know, when there's an administration changeover, if it goes from one party to another, so that you can continue to do your job. So that those government agencies, you know, just don't start over from scratch every 4 years, and there's actually some institutional knowledge about, you know, how to educate kids, how to keep the environment clean, how to do whatever. Trump wants to, and he very nearly did this at the end of his term, reclassify huge swaths of the federal civil service as political appointees. Meaning that if they did not show sufficient enthusiasm about the president or his proposals, they could be fired and replaced by people who were. And what's important to understand is that it actually used to be this way in the United States. The vast swaths of the federal government were essentially patronage positions. And if you go back and read about what it was like, it was very bad. Because you had huge numbers of people who were working in the federal government who knew nothing, because they were essentially just there as a political favor. And in this case, you know, this rewriting of Schedule F would supposedly, you know, allow for the president to have any number of people whose top priority is carrying out what he wants to do, not necessarily what the agency's guidelines are, not necessarily what the law might be, but you know, their obedience or their fealty to him. And I think when you look at Schedule F, that's where some of the darkest and most concerning stuff comes from, right? Because that's where you start really getting into authoritarianism if you have a government that's essentially staffed by people who are sworn to a particular leader. And so with those happy words, back to you.
To put a point on what Clay was saying, so this Schedule F, Trump actually tried this in his last months of his presidency. Biden did it, but literally, so right now, so you kind of can put something tangible on what this means. Right now, there's about 4,000 political appointees that the president gets to appoint in the federal government. This Schedule F that Trump tried, and now Project 2025 wants to move forward, would change that number from 4,000 political appointees to 50,000. And they are actively, right now, as Clay said, creating a database of people who will be loyal. That will be the only barrier to getting these government jobs. So from 4,000 to 50,000 federal jobs.
And also, if you don't do what you're told, you'll lose your job, and it's just tough. Too bad. That's just too bad. Can I add something about with the legislature? One of the things that I really wanted to make sure I also mentioned is the current Speaker of the House also established a committee that was called Welfare Reform, but that's not what it was going to really do. He is of the mindset that we should not have any assistance for the poor. That just should not ever exist, because if you're able-bodied, you should be working. And so this committee tried a couple of times, tried to criminalize the houseless. That failed, thank goodness, because the community around Kansas came together and fought against it. The other one was adding even more regulations on you know, when you can get food stamp, SNAP benefits. And you get SNAP benefits, those are limited benefits anyway, but they were adding a lot of work requirements, and then they added, you know, they expanded the age range of who could be eligible for that. That also backfired, thank goodness. But I can foresee that some of those things are going to come back. That there will be continued, he's trying to dismantle some of the welfare system that we have, because again, that follows along with Project 2025, especially when it comes out of a department that is a department for life. Yeah, and it'll do away with so many things. Healthcare will not be the same. There's a line in there about healthcare. It should be patient-centered, which is, hey, that's cool, but it should also be market-driven. If you have Medicare, they are going to try to get more people with Medicare to go into the Advantage programs.
I just wanted to briefly add something related to Schedule F and the recruitment that's currently going on. What we often hear is a question of how likely is this to occur if the former president takes office again. And what I would kind of liken it to in the US recently would be that fake electors scheme, where the leader of Project 2025 was recently quoted as saying, we already have a plan in progress, we already have a plan in place. The same thing happened in Venezuela when Maduro took over and he had a National Assembly that was from the opposition. They just dissolved the entire parliament and then created something entirely different, and then stacked the National Assembly with people who were pro-Maduro. So we have seen these things happen in authoritarian regimes before, and prior to that happening in Venezuela, that was a democratic republic. So like, is it likely? Yeah, and it seems that there's actually been a long-term plan going on, going back to how we started this program off, but just kind of like below the surface, and now they're being more open about it. So is this actually like something that's possible? Yes, because they've been planning it for a very long time.
If you can't get it done nationally, then where do you start then? Locally, on the state level.
So clearly we could talk for a really long time about this. I want to take a quick break before we get to Q&A, and I want to acknowledge the volunteers in the room who helped put this night together. Can I get our volunteers and our board members to stand up and just say thank you to everyone who's helping us out with this? To our Smooch staff in the back who are running our tech and helping us out with the event. I really appreciate all that you do for us. Thank you. All right, I see you back there furiously going through all of those Q&A cards that you're getting from our audience. I've got one up here that I'm going to start with, but go ahead and bring them up when you're ready, and we'll try to get to as many. We've scheduled about another half hour for this evening. I'd love for y'all to stay to answer some of these questions. If we can't answer your question, we'll try to find a way to follow up. But clearly there's too many questions here for us to be able to answer. But let's start with this one. We've done doom and gloom. Let's try to talk about action. Let's talk about what we can do and maybe get this a little bit lighter. How can we talk to people in our lives about the changes, the changers at Project 2025? Where do we start? Anybody want to take the first try?
I mean, I think it's very important to just be factual, that this exists, that there are major folks connected to Trump who are part of it, and that many of the proposals in it are very extreme. I think it is possible to over-egg it, just like it's possible to over-egg anything. I think, the future is not the future until it's here. But I think you can certainly, I think the truth is the truth. The document is there, it's online. You can go see it. You can go see all the things about abortion that were just mentioned. You can see all the things about education. And anyone who says, oh, this has nothing to do with Trump, you just have to say, or nothing to do with, mainstream anything, it's just this weird little project. Well, no, it is right, not mainstream. It's his guys, and they are mostly guys. It's his guys.
So I would first of all, recommend that everyone go and read the entire 900-page document. Okay, with that, that's like me telling my kiddos in college, like, do your homework, right? So I know that's not going to happen. Some of you will, but I do. It's crazy the way the document is written, because so many things are woven into different sections that you don't appreciate nuances as to what would happen to our government. So, notwithstanding my direction of reading the entire document, if you don't have a couple of days to sit down and read all 900 pages, there are some really good materials out there that all you have to do is Google, summary Project 20. You can get the high points, but if you have the time and the stomach, I would dig in because there's so much there. And then for the hopeful point, like how to go forward, then when you're talking to your neighbors and your family, you actually kind of know what you're talking about. But just know there's some really good summary documents out there. You don't have to pull up the entire 900-page document, but if you can, do it.
I think I'll just add briefly to that. Obviously, attending programs like this, I think you're recording it for YouTube, so you could share that, or we were talking about podcasts similar to what you're saying. The other thing is, if you know your audience, find the policies that they care about and look up the information that what's going to happen to those policies. So we happen to live in a community that is a pretty strong supporter of public education. Do you think we should continue to have public education? Because if the answer is yes, then probably you don't want Project 2025 to be implemented. Or do we think that we should continue to take care of seniors? If the answer is yes, then maybe let's talk, that's another avenue to talk to people. So know who you're talking to and what issues are important to them, and then speak directly to what's in that document and how it's going to affect them personally.
Well, Project 2025, it's a book. And they're book clubs. If you're in a book club, you could take one chapter at a time and really get into the weeds with it. Invite somebody, a legislator, a city council member, somebody that can come to your group and just talk about it, talk it through, I think that would be cool.
Have lots of wine at that book club. So I do want to mention a couple resources. We talked about reading the whole 900 pages. I think that's a bit overwhelming. Democracy Forward also has a People's Guide to Project 2025. That's a much more bite-sized way of kind of looking at this. I like a Facebook page called Project 2025 Says. Again, bite-sized ways to understand things that are inside the document. There's lots of resources for you to be able to kind of look at this and get the facts and really understand what it is. That doesn't necessarily lean into the doom and gloom and the sky is falling rhetoric. I think a lot of that rhetoric is valid, but it can be overwhelming, especially when we start looking at the document and start thinking about, okay, what does this really mean? How do I talk about this with people who may not see things the way I do, but also care deeply about our community and about our country? So there's some really great resources out there. I want to thank our audience for sending in these questions. There's a lot of good ones in here. No way we're going to answer the 30 or so in my hand. But I want to acknowledge somebody kind of sent in a card saying, hey, mainstream is nonpartisan. This doesn't feel nonpartisan. And I want to acknowledge that is absolutely the vibe in the room tonight. We've talked about Trump. We've called out a certain party. We've talked about members of that party in their state legislature. And I recognize that doesn't feel as comfortable for those of us who want to see a more collaborative nature in our two parties, and so I want to acknowledge that. Unfortunately, with this document, with this agenda, it does fall on one side of the aisle, and I also want to acknowledge that because that's something that to not acknowledge is to turn a blind eye, I think, to some of the powers behind the movement. But mainstream is committed to being nonpartisan. We started as an organization of multi-faith leaders who were moderates in our state. And unfortunately, that needle has just moved a lot in the last 31 years since mainstream started. And moderate doesn't quite mean the same and isn't quite as visible in our state. We'd love to get back to that. And I think that the people in this room, based on kind of the reactions I'm seeing tonight, would like to see us get back to a place where we can have conversations where we're not talking about these extreme issues. We're talking about how to make Kansas a place where people thrive. Not just a very narrow set of people in Kansas, but everybody can thrive. So thank you for calling that out. Thank you for acknowledging whoever submitted that card. I do want to thank you for kind of putting us on the spot and saying, hey, let's try to be a little bit more nonpartisan in this conversation. But on that note, here's a good question. Dr. B, this might be for you or it might be for anybody. Do you believe that the education defunding efforts are deliberately intended to create a less informed and critical population, thus perpetuating a goal of one-party rule?
Well, actually, I want to hear what you said first.
There's a lot in the document that, in terms of undermining education and attacking what I would consider the liberal arts and how we develop critical thinking skills. And to that extent, if you can actually limit students' exposure to how to develop critical thinking skills, then yes, in the future, you're basically just going to have a bunch of people that follow whatever the charismatic leader says. So this is it I don't like to put intent on people, but I can see where for some of the people working on that project, that's absolutely the goal. For someone who's been studying education policy, I can say that concern has been there for decades. And so we can already start to kind of see some of that going on.
So this is what I believe with a question like that. And this is the nonpartisan bit, actually. I think the kind of extreme proposals that are in Project 2025, I honestly don't believe that most Republicans believe or want those things. I don't think most Democrats believe or want those things, or most independents. I think they are a menu of extreme ideas. That being said, you have to ask then, well, why is it that we're all here and we're talking about this menu of extreme ideas that we know that probably most people in both parties don't want? And I think it's really important to keep your eye on the fact that so much money comes into our political system because people want let's put it this way, if you are someone incredibly wealthy, if you're a billionaire, it doesn't matter if you're gay. It doesn't matter if you're a woman. It doesn't matter if you're black. It doesn't matter, your education is taken care of. Your health care is taken care of. If you're a billionaire, you don't have to, you can eat. All of these things are not on your mind at all. What is on your mind if you're a billionaire is what kind of regulations the government has, what your tax rates are, what the tax rates are of your business, and all of these questions. And I understand too, both Democrats and Republicans oftentimes believe that there's not as much separating their parties as there should be. But I tell you, folks who put money into the political system know what they want. And they want lower taxes and they want less regulation. And they're willing to support the candidate or the cause that gets them closer to making more money. Because all of this other stuff, it doesn't apply to them. If you're a billionaire, you're never going to have to worry about getting an abortion or getting abortion care for someone in your family. You're going to be able to always get it. You're never going to worry about how any of this stuff. So I think it's really important when we talk about this extremism to just look at that big picture, and it's like, who is benefiting, who is paying, and who is supporting and allowing this kind of extremism to flourish. And it's usually not the people who are going to be harmed by it.
Thank you. I've got a couple questions, Dr. Castle, about the Comstock Act, so I'm going to I'll just throw these two at you. Would the Comstock Act apply to FedEx and other private mail services?
Yes.
Yes. Could the current Congress pass a law eliminating that act before the new administration is voted in 2025?
Congress could repeal the Comstock Act, but it ain't gonna happen before November.
Divided party, divided chambers.
All right, there's a couple cards in here that I think ask an obvious question, but is really hard to answer. Project 2025 goes after the most vulnerable in our society. This person specifically calls out non-Christian women and children. My question is, why is there so much hatred? Who wants to answer that one?
Well, I mean, I would say again, if you look at the folks who benefit, they don't see any cost from inciting it because they're able to live lives that insulate themselves from any hatred. I mean, I think that's the most cynical answer possible. If you're not affected, what do you care that people hate one another?
The other thing I failed to mention is Christian nationalism and white supremacy are hand in hand. So once you know that, you kind of know where some of the hatred's coming from.
So a couple questions here that get to the root a little bit more of democracy in our government and the protection of it. So does 2025 rely only on a willing president or executive? There is no need, as they see it, to cooperate with the legislative branch. I noticed that they don't mention the judicial branch in this question. If so, this corroborates the dictatorship fears that only a strong executive is needed. It's not really a question here, but I kind of wonder if anybody wants to comment about the threat against democracy, the threat against the way that our government's currently established with this agenda.
Well, I mean, somebody else want to go first? Okay. So one of the things I would say is that the exact stuff that I'm talking about that led to a rise in conservative groups, you know, you look at the New Deal, you look at the Great Society, there has been an expansion in the federal government, and largely the expansion in the federal government is the expansion of the executive branch and the executive agencies. This is not something that's just driven by one party or the other. There has been a consistent movement towards concentrating more power in the president. I mean, you know, in the 1800s, in like the 1860s and 1870s, you could visit the White House and just walk in and say hi to the president. It was not seen as that important, right? Because the Congress was where everything was done. The president was just the CEO, or I mean, just kind of the person who made things happen. So I think that what you see in Project 2025 is in many ways a natural, I mean, I don't want to say natural, but if you are really interested in having a government where the executive can do whatever he or she wants, and this is something that we know that in the first Trump term, he repeatedly hit walls on because he was wanting to do things that folks said he couldn't do. So if you come to it from that perspective, you're like, well, how do we knock down those barriers? How do we give that person even more power? And again, I think this is something that to an extent, you know, no one wants to give up power. Like even if you're the Democratic president, would you really want to give it up? Or to, you know, it's like, no, I can do it for good. I'm going to use it for good. So it's a trend, and I think that Project 2025 is an extreme variant on that trend, but it's, you know, it's a trend that comes from a lot of different directions. I mean, if you all remember unitary executive theory from George W. Bush's term that allowed him to do a lot of, you know, secret prisons and stuff like that. I mean, it's the same kind of push. Now, does that necessarily segue into authoritarianism? I think that's where the fear is right now.
I've got one one or two questions depending on how quickly we can get through these, and then we can wrap up our evening here. A couple folks are asking us specifically about comparing this to Trump's Agenda 47, to other efforts out there, other documented either plans or comments in the public that may align with Project 2025 but aren't exactly Project 2025. So I'm wondering, can someone speak to kind of what we're seeing out there and how we can compare and contrast those?
So Agenda 47, if you haven't heard of it, is you can go on former President Trump's website and see what his agenda would be for his next presidency. And we were actually talking about Agenda 47. It's kind of an interesting document in that there's some bullet points with all caps and some exclamation marks and kind of like literally. But if you distill the policies from Agenda 47 with the policies from Project 2025, they don't match up perfectly, but they match pretty damn close. So if you look at Agenda 47, and there are some bullet points, you can go in and look do a little bit deeper dive, but much of the stuff, like particular on like immigration, like mass deportations of immigrants, much of the stuff matches Project 2025 with Trump's Agenda 47, which is why, the whole, trying to distance himself from Project 2025, he really can't from a practical standpoint, but when you just literally match up his policies with Project 2025, Project 2025 is much more granular and in detail, but they match pretty much the same.
I think if you do a word search in the document itself, I think Trump's name comes up 312 times, I believe. So this isn't a question, but I do want to kind of read it out because I think that this was a conversation we had during our bad faith screenings. Project 2025 is a so-called Christian document. We call it Christian nationalism. What has been the response from various Christian organizations like Catholics, Methodists, other denominations? What allies do we have to get the word out about this? I can't answer on behalf of organized religion, but it's definitely something that people, no, not going to do that tonight. But it's definitely something that as we are talking with members of the faith community, they're worried and they're saying, yeah, we need to speak up more. And so I'm going to turn this question into a challenge. If you are a member of a church or a synagogue or a mosque or some organized religion, talk about this. Talk about the threat of Christian nationalism. Talk about Project 2025. Be the voice. If it's not already part of your conversation, be the one who starts it. Because that, again, those are their tools for mobilizing people. They can be yours too. Make sure that we're not letting them dominate the conversation in our spaces. All right, I'm going to conclude tonight because I see people very quietly trying to leave the room. But before I do, any last words from our panelists tonight? Any last comments?
I just wanted to say, that in the Kansas legislature, there are a lot of legislators, not just Democrats. We talked about many Republicans, some very few modern Republicans, because there aren't very many left anymore, who really do try to come together and work on issues. I'd like to get on the Health and Human Services Committee and on the Social Services Budget Committee. So there's been a lot of compromising that we've been able to do. So there are pockets of moments when we are able to work together and to stop ridiculous bills that have come across primarily from the Senate. Things like, all the anti-vaccine. There's plenty of folks senators who, two senators that don't want vaccinations at all. None. Or to try to take away the authority of the Secretary of Health. But there's plenty of legislators who we were able to get together and not just stop, but not even hear those bills. So there are ways that we do compromise, and I just want everybody to know that we do try to find ways to compromise.
I think I would just say, being in a county where, in this county where we've seen kind of a resurgence of centrism and Democrats and Republicans coming together to sort of, correct the path, I was gonna say right the ship, but maybe that's not a good way to say it. But anyway, one of the big things that we can all do, and it's probably a little bit too late this time around, but still in the future to keep thinking about, is voting in primaries. We've seen this last primary election how that matters. So if we can get enough people, just all of us get more people to vote in primaries, that's all I'm gonna say.
I would just say one thing, which is I understand that we're in Kansas. Unless elephants start flying tomorrow, we're probably not going to be in contention seriously on election day for the Electoral College, right? And I think that can sometimes leave folks a little disconnected or a little depressed when it comes to stuff like this, because we're not in one of the 7 states or whatever it is that quote unquote make a difference. But I would say that what I tell people and what I write repeatedly is, the government still that affects people the most, that has the most to do with your day-to-day life, is your local government. That's your city or your town. That's your state government. The levels that are closest to you, when you know the folks there. Whatever you can do, your school boards, all of that, whatever you can do to participate and know about and engage in those levers of government, the better and healthier off we all, the better off we all are, the healthier we'll all be in being able to deal with big challenges like Project 2025.
So if I can keep your attention for one more minute, I want to again say thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to Smooch and the staff and all of our volunteers. Thank you to all of you for being here tonight. Thank you to our panelists. I'm so appreciative of it. That you all are aware of our next event, our last event in our Defending Democracy series, and that is our Get Out the Vote Brunch. It's in just a couple weeks, September 8th. You can come to our brunch and then go canvass for your favorite local candidate. For those of you who are in the room who made it this long, we are offering a 10% discount if you use the code Project 2025. So I hope that you will join us on that day. We'll be joined by Rachel Lazar. She is the CEO and President of Americans United for Church and State, is going to share some really great information with us about how we can be thinking about making sure the separation of church and state is strong here in Kansas. We are also doing candidate meet and greets with the League of Women Voters. There's 4 of them up on the screen. We have 1 in Wyandotte County on September 19th, and then 3 in Johnson County on October 1st, which is hosted right here in Smooch again. And then October 7th and October 17th. You don't have to register, just show up. If you don't follow Mainstream or the League of Women Voters of Johnson County, please sign up for our newsletters, please follow us on social media, and you'll be able to see all that information. And then finally, just a reminder to vote. I mean, it's so important, we've already heard about that. The election's coming up. So November election will be here before you know it. Last day to register, October 15th. Or the early in-person voting starts October 19th. The last day to apply for your mail ballot, October 29th. And please use those drop boxes. Make sure that those get returned. We don't want those to get lost. And as Clay said, vote down ticket. There's a lot of races on this ballot this year, and they're all important. If you like Mainstream as much as I do, please consider supporting us. That's how we're able to do events like this, how we're able to be in the State House during the session, and we can't do it without all of you. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful night.